We'll now switch to a live presentation from the laptop, and we have Johanna, Märtz and colleagues talking about spatial temporal variation in road crossing and collisions by rodia.
Well, thank you and welcome to our presentation. I'll be talking about comparing the spatial temporal variation in road crossings and vehicle collisions by rodia. This was part of my master thesis, and I was supervised by Manisha Bhardwaj from the Uni Freiburg, and then also worked together with the Forest Research Institute in Baden-Wuerttemberg. So, well, it should be known to every one of you that roads impact wildlife, as for example in wildlife vehicle collisions, which is quite nicely illustrated by this wonderful figure. And a collision is always a location where a species try to cross, so that would be the E movement in the figure. But then in some cases, however, the animal is of course unsuccessful, and that results in the D movement, or the D crash. And we wanted to investigate how these successful crossings are actually related with the unsuccessful crossings that well, ultimately result in a collision. There are a number of potential relationships, but I'm just going to go into the two most straightforward. So either a higher crossing could, well, you can still read it. A higher crossing would lead to a higher risk of a collision to occur. So that would mean that the environmental and the road characteristics rather influence the crossing frequency, and that in turn creates a collision hotspot. But the other option could be that crossings occur everywhere, and then only the roadside characteristics at a certain spot will determine if an area is risky for a collision to occur. So then the risk would be independent of the frequency of road crossings. And summarized, that is actually what we wanted to find out. So understand the relationship between the animal crossings and the spatial temporal patterns of collision hotspots. Well, to do so, we used rodia in Germany, and according to the question, we needed locations of deer vehicle collisions and then also GPS collaring data to identify the successful road crossings. And then there were 3 steps to the analysis. I'll just go through them shortly because it was quite, well, entangled. On the map, you see Hessen and Baden-Wuerttemberg in southwestern Germany. And then first, I used a species distribution model to model the probability of a collision to occur using 5 years of actual DVC locations or collision locations in Hessen. And then for modeling, I used environmental predictors such as land cover and then also the road characteristics. And to also include temporal changes in the risk of a collision to occur, I did 4 separate models according to the ecological seasons that are relevant to rodia ecology. So that would be gestation, lactation, rut, and diapause. And then this model was projected into Baden-Wuerttemberg and validated there using collision locations from 1 year. And this was quite nice because it gave us a really good indication that the model worked very well and also outside of the region that the model was trained in, which is a very nice validation for an SDM. And this projection was actually, well, necessary because then for Baden-Wuerttemberg, we had collaring data of 46 individuals, 46 GPS-collared individuals, which were collared in those 5 study areas that you see also on the map. So for the second step, using the SDM model then, I predicted a collision risk for all the roads in Baden-Wuerttemberg, as you see in this figure now, and then the predicted collision risk actually ranges from 0 to 1, and well, you see the road network and then the according risk according to the factors or the environmental factors that were found out to influence a collision risk. And, well, everyone probably knows, but just to notice real quick, DVC, you'll see that more often. That's the deer vehicle collision abbreviation. Oopsie. Well, and this figure also further includes 4 of the 5 study areas and shaded in gray the home ranges of the individuals that were collared in these areas. And then the rodia sent positions every 15 minutes, so I could calculate quite detailed the road crossing locations, which was really nice. And now, in order to relate the risk or the collision risk to the road crossing frequency, I filled the roads within the home ranges with sampling buffers every 100 meters. And then for each buffer point, so for example, as you see here, the point 141, I could assign the predicted collision risk and then the number of road crossings in that buffer for an individual corrected for the days sampled. So, for example, now that point 141 with the risk of 0.8, animal ID 1 crossed it 12 times in the 62 days that it was sampled. So, to get to my results, the species distribution model identified a number of environmental predictors to explain the risk of a collision to occur. And so I think the direct error of environmental predictors influencing deer vehicle collisions is quite clear. And now in this plot, you see the results for one male individual per ecological season. And the sampling buffers are now colored in the risk probability. So again, the 0 to 1, and then the size corresponds to the frequency of road crossings per day by that individual. Exactly, so then you actually can see one spot, for example. I don't think, you don't see my mouse, but, well, a bigger point is crossed more frequently in comparison with a smaller point. And, well, the black lines are the road network, and then it shaded in gray, again, the home range of that individual. So looking at the lactation and the rut plot, you see that the road or the risk colors changed slightly, but there was no indication for a spatially riskier season in comparison with others. So even though if focusing on one point, you see that they change a bit, generally you can say that the one road is less risky than the other road in all seasons. So that is why for now I have not actually added that temporal predictor influencing deer vehicle collisions, because for now I didn't actually have any reason to believe so. Then finally, to look at the diapause panel, interesting for this individual was that we could also identify his last crossing. So for 10 individuals, we had a crossing that actually ended in a collision involving that road deer. And this was quite nice because that is even more a validation. We not only have the risk probability for this individual, but then also the number of road crossings in that spot where it actually ultimately died. Exactly. And this analysis was actually done for all the individuals that we had. And so now on the x-axis you will see, again, the probability of a collision to occur, and then on the y-axis the predicted number of crossings per day, and the split per sex and then per season again. And what you actually see in this plot is now the answer to the hypothesis that I introduced in the beginning, because as you see, there seems to be a linear relationship with more crossings occurring in those areas where the probability of a collision to occur is high. And so that would indicate that some of the factors that I identified to influence the probability of a collision to occur actually influence crossings, which in turn creates a hotspot for collisions to occur. Because as you now can see with the graph, that with increasing road crossings, we can expect an increase of collision risk. And what we further can see in this graph is that the temporal predictor season actually influences the frequency of road crossings. So for both sexes, for example, you see that during the rut, they crossed roads more frequently than during the other seasons. And this would actually suggest now that the temporal predictor season rather influenced the road crossing probability, which in turn, again, influences a collision to occur. So that is why now you see the arrow that it goes via the road crossings influencing the collisions. So to summarize the main conclusions from the study, there are a number of environmental predictors directly influencing the probability of a collision to occur. And then the linear relationship of crossings with collisions furthermore indicated that some of the factors actually influence the probability of a crossing and then in turn influencing the collision risk. The model furthermore did not indicate a DVC risk or a more risky season in comparison with the others. However, what we could identify is that the ecological seasons rather influenced the frequency of road crossings, and this led to changing numbers of collisions throughout the year. As with more road crossings, also the number of collisions increases. And then, as I mentioned earlier, regarding the crossings that ended in collisions by the collared roe deer, we could suggest that collisions always occurred in buffers with a higher than average road crossing frequency. So, I mean, it's only 10 points, so we have to be very careful, but that kind of indicated that the collisions usually occur during routine movements in areas where they have crossed several times before. So that might actually indicate maybe they have been less attentive in these areas and, well, were hit at some point. So what we, of course, learned is that the relationship is very complicated, but we could at least study some or understand some of the factors and the information to compare the spatial-temporal relationship between the successful and the unsuccessful road crossings. But we only looked at the actual road crossing points. So what we could not study is if the road characteristics maybe influenced a movement before actually crossing. So in this figure, again, maybe the F and G movement, which would also be really interesting to relate to a collision to occur, because this might indicate a filtering or a barrier effect and could not only inform about how rodeo cross the street, but then also how they approach the roads and for what reason they might actually be crossing, and if also this can be correlated or linked to the collision risk to happen. And, well, we'll see, maybe that's something for the future. For now, thank you for your attention, and if there's any questions or feedbacks, you're welcome to ask now or send a mail later. Thank you.
Were you expecting the relationship between crossings and collisions to be linear? I'm just trying to think, is that?
I think we did expect this kind of relationship because, well, generally it makes sense that where they cross, they have to collide. They have to cross the roads in order to have a collision. So that was always the difficult point. Do they collide where they cross, or do what is the relationship? So we did expect this linear relationship. But what I maybe didn't mention, it starts not at zero, so they cross everywhere, and that's also what you saw in the figure, and what we actually saw in all the rodeo that we had. They do cross everywhere, but there seems to be the connection that they cross more in the higher collision risk areas. So yeah, to answer your question, I think we expected it in some sense.
So they cross more in the higher collision risk areas because of the design of the road or the landscape?
I would expect that, yeah, that there's the factors that rather influenced a rodeo to decide to cross there rather than a collision to occur there.
What about the traffic? I mean, how can we make connection with the traffic? Because if we talk about collisions, we have to estimate the volume of the traffic.
Definitely, it's a very good question. We had, as road characteristics that we included into the SDM model, we also included road category. So that would, it's 5 categories that the roads are categorized in, and they are, or you can classify them into speed and ADT, the annual daily traffic volume kind of groups. At least you can say that the highway has a higher ADT than now a stateway or something. But, and road category actually came out as a factor influencing the collision risk quite clearly. But we do discuss that road category is not a good enough factor to actually use in collision risk, that ADT levels should actually be available for the roads to be able to really understand that influence of ADT levels on collision risk.
Yes, but also we have to see the seasonal changes of the traffic of the volume, because if you see the gas station and all the phases of the life cycle, we have to see also how this can be connected, of the differences between the traffic volume per month, per season.
Definitely, yeah. And also daily. I mean, that was something that we didn't include in our model, but we, looked at the data. Looking at the data, you see that, of course, the most collisions occur dawn and dusk and at night, and also to discuss that kind of influence of the changing levels. You're right.
We have time for one last question. No? Then great.